March 1972. Studio 1, NBC Burbank. The red tally light blinked on camera 2, and somewhere in the control booth the producer's hand hovered over a 7-second delay button that didn't exist yet. Johnny Carson sat behind the desk that had become, without legislation or ceremony, the most powerful 4 feet of wood grain in American entertainment. Across from him, Dean Martin slouched in the guest chair with the particular physics of a man who had spent 30 years making relaxation look like an art form. The studio audience, 240 people who had waited 6 months for tickets, sensed something in the air that television historians would spend decades trying to name. It wasn't chaos, it was permission. By 1972, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson had become the financial engine of the National Broadcasting Company and the cultural gatekeeper of American fame. An appearance with Carson could sell 500,000 books in a week, fill concert halls for a year, or resurrect a career that Las Vegas had already buried. The show generated 17% of NBC's total profit while occupying only 2.5 hours of weekly programming. Carson himself had negotiated a contract that gave him $4 million annually and unprecedented control over content, guests, and broadcast standards. He was not merely a host, he was a kingmaker operating under Klieg lights, and everyone in Hollywood understood the physics of his smile. Dean Martin arrived that night carrying the peculiar authority of a man who had survived everything. He had outlasted the big band era, the Rat Pack mythology, his own television variety show, and the steady transformation of American entertainment from elegance to irony. At 54, Martin projected a kind of boredom with fame that younger performers mistook for indifference, but that Carson recognized immediately as mastery. They had known each other for years, moved through the same industry corridors, attended the same late-night gatherings where the real negotiations of Hollywood occurred over bourbon and silence. What happened during that interview would never air again in its complete form, not because it was censored, but because the invisible boundary it crossed, the line between what could be said among men in private and what could be performed for America during dinner, would shift so dramatically in the following decades that the original broadcast became a kind of cultural artifact from a country that no longer quite existed. The conversation began conventionally enough. Carson opened with questions about Dean Martin's film work, his upcoming concert schedule, the perpetual rumors about his drinking that Martin deflected with the weary expertise of a man who had turned alcoholism into a brand before anyone knew what personal branding meant. The audience laughed on cue. The cameras captured Martin's angular face in the 3/4 profile that directors had been lighting since 1946. Then, Carson did what he did better than any broadcaster in television history. He stopped performing. He leaned back, the microphone picking up the creak of his chair, and asked Martin about women. Not in the coy, innuendo-heavy style that variety shows had perfected, but directly, about affairs, about marriages, about the particular loneliness of hotel rooms in cities where everyone knew your face, but nobody knew which floor you were staying on. Martin, reading the shift in temperature the way a jazz musician hears a key change, responded in kind. What followed was 11 minutes of conversation that would be impossible to imagine on contemporary broadcast television. They discussed infidelity with the casual frankness of men who assumed that every person watching had made similar compromises. They joked about prenuptial agreements before the term entered common vocabulary. Martin told a story about a woman in Chicago that ended with a punchline so specific about gender dynamics and transactional intimacy that Carson had to steady himself against the desk to control his laughter. The studio audience, caught between shock and complicity, roared. There were no 4-letter words, no explicit descriptions. The conversation operated entirely within the technical boundaries of FCC regulations, but the assumptions it revealed about masculinity, about fame, about what powerful men expected from the world and what the world was expected to tolerate, belonged to a code that would be systematically dismantled over the next 4 decades. Dick Cavett, watching from New York, would later describe the interview as two apex predators comparing notes. Tom Shales, the television critic who understood Carson better than most, wrote that the exchange revealed the unspoken contract between mid-century American men and the entertainment industry that laundered their lives into prime-time mythology. Carson himself never discussed the interview in detail, but in a 1989 conversation with Bob Newhart that was recorded but never broadcast, he referred to it as the last night we could still talk like human beings on television. The cultural power of that moment rested not in its content, but in its assumptions. Carson and Martin spoke from a position of total security, insulated by fame, wealth, and an industry structure that protected their stars with the fierce loyalty of a medieval guild. They believed, correctly in 1972, that their value to the network was so absolute that no single interview could endanger their positions. They believed, also correctly, that the audience watching from living rooms across America would interpret their candor as authenticity rather than arrogance. And they believed with the certainty of men who had never been proven wrong that the rules governing public discourse would remain stable. The desk between Carson and his guests had become, by that point in television history, a symbol of negotiated power. It was where politicians came to soften their images, where actors came to pretend their careers weren't collapsing, where comedians came to audition for Carson's approval in segments that could make or destroy club bookings for years. Carson controlled the distance, the lighting, the length of each segment, and, most importantly, the unspoken permission structure that determined which vulnerabilities could be exposed and which remained protected. With Martin, the desk became something else, a confessional booth between equals, broadcast to 30 million witnesses who were being invited, temporarily, into a conversation that usually occurred only after the cameras stopped rolling. The invitation was intoxicating precisely because it felt forbidden, even though nothing technically prohibited it. NBC received 47 phone calls during the broadcast, which was negligible by standards that would emerge in later decades. A few dozen letters arrived in the following week, most of them positive, some merely confused about whether what they had witnessed constituted humor or documentary. The network filed the tape without comment. Carson moved on to the next show, which featured George Carlin doing material about language that would seem quaint by comparison within 5 years. But something had been documented that would become impossible to replicate, not because the technology changed, or because Carson retired, or because Martin died in 1995 with a legacy so complex that his obituaries struggled to find a single coherent narrative. The impossibility came from the transformation of surveillance itself. By the mid-1990s, with the emergence of cable news cycles that required constant content refresh, every statement made on broadcast television became potential ammunition. By the 2000s, with internet forums archiving every interview and cultural criticism becoming a participatory sport rather than a specialized profession, the idea that a celebrity could speak candidly about their personal compromises without facing organized campaigns became obsolete. By the 2010s, with social media collapsing the distinction between public performance and private belief, the very concept of off-the-record candor broadcast to millions had become a logical contradiction. Contemporary late-night television hosts operate under a different physics. They are curators of safety, managers of brand consistency, navigators of an attention economy where a single 12-second clip can generate more controversy than an entire hour once did. They cannot afford the luxury of authenticity that Carson and Martin performed that night in 1972, because authenticity has been redefined as liability. This is not an argument for nostalgia. The entertainment industry that protected Carson and Martin also systematically excluded women from positions of institutional power,
treated sexual harassment as an inevitable cost of doing business, and constructed mythologies of masculinity that justified exploitation as charisma. The dismantling of that system represents moral progress, even as it forecloses certain kinds of conversational possibility. What the Carson Martin interview reveals is not that television used to be better, but that it used to operate under a different social contract. Audiences in 1972 understood, at least implicitly, that Carson was performing a version of himself that emphasized certain truths while concealing others. They did not expect total transparency because they did not believe total transparency was possible or even desirable. They wanted entertainment that felt real without requiring it to be comprehensive.
The red light on camera 2 stayed lit for 11 minutes, capturing a conversation that would be referenced in film studies courses, gender studies seminars, and media ethics discussions for decades. Students watching the footage in 2025 often react with a kind of anthropological fascination, as though witnessing a ritual from a civilization that left no written explanation of its beliefs. The laughter sounds different to contemporary ears, more complicit, more knowing, more comfortable with hierarchies that have since been named and challenged. Carson's desk, sold at auction in 2005 for $87,000, sits now in a private collection in Los Angeles. The buyer, a television producer who grew up watching The Tonight Show in the 1980s, has said he purchased it not as memorabilia, but as a historical object, a physical remnant of the apparatus through which American culture negotiated its self-image for 3 decades. The tonight that Carson and Martin crossed an invisible boundary has not been rebroadcast in full since 1987. Clips circulate online, context-free and unsanctioned, accompanied by comment threads that argue about whether what was captured represents honesty or toxicity, humor or harm. Both interpretations are probably correct. The difficulty lies in accepting that they are not mutually exclusive. In the control booth that night, the producer's hand never moved toward the delay button that wouldn't be installed until later. There was no mechanism to stop what was happening, because no one had yet imagined that stopping it would become necessary. The system was built on trust that Carson understood where the lines were, trust that audiences would interpret his transgressions as performance rather than belief, trust that fame conferred a kind of immunity to consequence. That trust, like the desk and the microphone and the red tally light, has become a historical object now. We can study it, catalog it, argue about whether its destruction represents loss or liberation, but we cannot recreate the conditions that made it possible, because we are no longer the audience that once sat in those living rooms, leaning forward, laughing without quite knowing why.